So just as a level set, it's an interesting time as it relates to personalization. Audiences generally on the web are being catered to more and more, and that tends to raise their level of expectations. They have more of an expectation of a personalized digital experience to really foster lasting engagement. And that does create an opportunity for associations, many of which haven't really begun this path, but we see a lot of possibilities with organizations that really know their audiences and have the ability to glean even more information to create a well thought out personalization strategy. Briefly, I just want to give you a little bit of background about Unleashed Technologies. We are striving and focused on being the best without exceptions or excuses. We've been working in the digital marketplace for more than 14 years. We have 50 certified developers, designers, sales and marketing folks. We've been mentioned in the Inc. 5000 multiple times. We're also with the independent firm Clutch.co. We highly encourage people to check us out on there. We're the #1 ranked digital firm in Maryland. We're also highly ranked in DCM, Maryland, DC area. We're the #1 global ranking in Drupal development. We're also the #5 global ranking for B2B service providers. We have a 90% client satisfaction rate. We have 95% client retention. There's 150 overall clients we work with in more than 100 associations. We are certified in Drupal. We work with Symfony, which is now the underpinning of Drupal. We work with WordPress, Adobe Commerce Cloud, and we're also one of the first firms, and maybe one of the only ones in the US, to be Acquia certified personalization solutions partner. We have numerous association clients, as I mentioned. These are a few of them, ranging from military to CPAs to nursing to marketing associations. And each group is different, but we also bring a lot of broad perspective to help a lot of our different association clients. So I'm going to get right into it real quick. So overall, we want you to understand some things to think about around establishing a team to undertake this, ways to think about setting your goals for your website and other platforms, thinking about behavior data that you can look at, but do so with a bit of a skeptical eye. We want to make sure that we're thinking about segmenting users and then talking about how to think about content that really aligns with those segmentations. So before we dive in, these are a couple quotes that I've always found to be helpful, and I think especially with this topic, they're even more so. So one of them is from the former NCAA basketball coach, John Wooden, who would always say, never let what you can't do interfere with what you can do. And based on how many titles UCLA won, I think that was pretty good advice. Also, a friend of mine has loved to say over the years, everything worth doing is worth measuring. And then another friend of mine would love to say, are you right or are you sure? And I think these are especially important as we think about what we're targeting, who we're measuring, how we're measuring it, and getting away from assumptions that aren't based in data. There's a lot of research around this topic, as I'm sure many of you know. And these are a couple stats that really jumped out to us. One is a Forbes Insight study that found that only 25% of business leaders believe that their customers are even loyal to the brands. And 62% say the concept of loyalty is close to obsolete. Also, an Accenture study found that 81% of consumers really want brands to understand them better. And we interpret that as really creating a need for experiences that are informed by their preferences and their interests. Moving on, we also have found that most people haven't really begun this journey, that more than 60% or approximately 60% of marketing leaders in 2019 in a Gartner survey said that they don't feel that they have an effective personalization strategy or roadmap. So I think the solace can be taken is that it's not too late to start, and there's a lot of folks that haven't really figured this out yet either. So we're going to start with just looking at establishing your team. And I don't think this is an actual quote from Star Wars, but I sort of felt like I had Yoda's voice in my head when I was writing it down. So that was a good way to characterize a lot of what needs to happen. Now, we're going to run through a lot of different roles. And it's not that every single role has to be a separate person, but it is good to be thinking about who's going to wear these hats and how you're going to proceed. So there's a lot of roles, as I mentioned, and all of them should be tied to the data analyst, who we're going to talk about each individual role. But we want to make sure that people are ensuring that there's proper buy-in, proper insights are being gleaned, helping inform the right approach and execution. And we want to make sure that regardless of what the role is, people really are thinking about the data and having a real relationship and dialogue with the data analyst. So the data analyst needs to gather, review and distill data, supporting user journeys and content recommendations. And they also very much need to be responsible, available to people, curious about where the data can take them, and communicative. It also helps to be something of a storyteller so that you can really make key data points resonate with your internal audiences, so that can help you better understand who you're really trying to target. You need an executive sponsor, especially with something like personalization. It tends to go across a lot of silos, a lot of platforms, and you really need somebody at a high level who can move the pieces that need to be moved within an organization to get resources and buy-in. Otherwise, you're going to be in a fragmented situation, which really isn't going to be advocating for the user. You also need a customer experience advocate who is a point person who is really, in a sense, role-playing the role of your user and looking out very specifically for where the hiccups might be in a flow that works for the user. And then they communicate back, and they're very much in touch with other roles. But without that advocate for the user, it can be a very slippery slope into creating something that a lot of people put a lot of work into, but really isn't hitting the mark or reaching the goals. You need a digital strategist who is understanding both the organization's needs and how to translate those into digital tactics, which will be executed as part of this. And you need content leads. And I put this in plural for the simple reason that the content effort on real personalization is not something that really one person can handle, or probably should. And it also doesn't have to be or should be limited to text. So video production, writing for different audiences, writing from different content perspectives is all part of this mix. And you also need a technologist who can understand each piece of the technology involved between a content management system, a member association platform, various tools that might pull in, like a higher logic or other pieces. Or we work with Acquia a lot, so a lot of the Acquia tools that would be helpful as well, to really understand how everything fits together early, so that when decisions are being made through plans, that there's nothing that falls through the cracks or needs to be scrambled to be adjusted, so that you can really ensure that seamless user experience. You also need a UX designer who, obviously most people work with one when it comes to website redesigns, and it's something that's a key part of this, and they play probably a more traditional role than some other people in this, but they also have to think in terms of how these different pieces work, whether you're building customized buttons or certain widgets that have personalized content, and just how this all flows together. So next, we're going to talk about setting some goals. And this quote from Henry David Thoreau really jumped out at me. What you get by achieving your goals is not as important as what you become by achieving your goals. And I also thought, who better than a transcendentalist to set up the right perspective on this? This is really a cultural shift for a lot of organizations. And so it's not about checking boxes, but it really does become about how you're embracing this approach and what you can really become as an organization to make that pivot. When you're setting goals, you want to understand what can be personalized. You want to define your key performance indicators. You want to determine the data that's most important. And then you want to develop the cross-platform user journeys that are going to help guide the user experience. You also want to define what can be personalized. So that includes everything from knowing what data you have to inform personalization choices, understanding how you're going to measure success. Can you visually see the content in a context that is what the user would see? So if you're putting content in a certain place, is it competing with something that it shouldn't? Is it making sense as it was intended? And do you overall have the bandwidth to support this type of work from a content perspective? So in terms of defining your KPIs, we really think about these as indicators of the progress your organization is making towards meeting your specific goals. And some of these goals, but definitely not all of them, include looking at increase of membership, increasing of member engagement with very specific content, reports, et cetera, increase of brand awareness for your association, increasing your average timeline, or increasing your average lifetime value. So how much does it cost to keep and retain members? And is this helping you to more easily and more effectively improve that situation? And then also engaging the engagement by geography. There's a wonderful opportunity to target your content to where people are, both metaphorically and literally. And then as we're thinking about performance tracking, looking at things like page visits to the membership sign-up page, understanding bounce rates across their journey, tracking their interests across multiple channels, bringing in the data that really helps you understand how they're behaving, what they're looking for, what you can glean from what they would appreciate being given. These are definitely important pieces. Also, obviously looking at web traffic, Google page rankings, how far down on page they go, and understanding at a really deep level what their experience is on mobile versus a desktop versus potentially, a tablet or other devices. You also want to determine what data is really most important to your organization. So looking at a visitor's membership status, understanding the frequency with which they visit your website, understanding the types of content that they frequently visit, both from a content type as well as a category type. So you can really flesh out a lot of user interest by keeping a really close eye on that and understanding if you're really tagging your content the right way. And also if you have certain membership information where they can self-select what they're interested in, mapping that tagging to those interests is also a key piece. Understanding what their titles and organizations are, where they are in their career. I think some people who are later in their career, there's a bit of a shorthand you can kind of get away with from a content perspective, but people who are newer, they may not know exactly what you mean or not know who to talk to about it. So thinking about understanding at all those levels, even if you're a fairly targeted association, is important. And then obviously things like demographics around age, sex, ethnicity, income, marital status. And again, the geolocation is really important. And these are not everything, but these are definitely some key pieces to have put into a plan. You also want to develop initial user journeys. And this is where you're both prioritizing your users as well as thinking about the paths they take through the experience. And so as you're looking to prioritize, you want to potentially use the PI framework, which stands for potential, importance, and ease. So potential refers to where can you really make an improvement from a personalization approach? How important is this? How valuable is this information to the user? And how easy is this to actually execute on and test on? Because if you're not able to test, again, if it's worth doing, it's worth measuring. And if you don't have a clear understanding of how you would measure success, it's really something you should be thinking closely about before you pursue it. And then there's also tools like digital relevancy maps, which is sort of a grid view that brings in your persona information, the funnel stages that people might be going through, as well as whatever content and functionality they might encounter, so that you can have a really great snapshot kind of dashboard view of what the expectation is that you're building for with those users. Next, we're going to talk about reviewing behavioral data. So it's really important with any data you get to be, I think having a baseline skepticism is really important, because it's easy to be led astray by something that seems important, but without understanding the right context, it can really be a challenge, or it can send you down the wrong path, which many organizations have done in the past. So we're going to talk a little bit about what behavior data is. We're going to talk about some gaps to avoid, and we're going to talk about how to fill some of those gaps. So behavior data is any data that's collected as a visitor or a member moves through an association's digital space. And this can include everything from the device they're using, what videos they've engaged with, what pictures, where the content is located. Is it in a silo? Is it embedded with content? Are they using certain forms? What's the user experience with that form? Are they already logged in? Can that data possibly populate that form? Understanding, what can be gleaned and what can be added to these pieces is really important. And obviously how the user got to your website is critically important, because that can really give you a lot of insight into crafting those personas and understanding what is also important to them beyond the purview of your own digital ecosystem. There's numerous gaps that can really complicate a better understanding of your users. Everything from third-party shopping carts that might have just been kind of plugged into your website, but you don't always have the insights of when they dropped the funnel of the purchase, or there's sometimes challenges around getting the right data integrated with other profiles you may have on your users. Understanding how partially integrated systems work as it relates to gleaning the data. If you have an integration where it's one way, sometimes you don't have the dialogue within that system, which can be a challenge. Or you could be looking at corrupted data. So sometimes web bots can really spike some traffic, but they're not real people, and they're not really the target audiences you want to be facing or targeting to. And then the big thing we've noticed sometimes is that people don't always have a baseline with which to measure against. So looking at how to establish a generic control so you don't just yield stats to a larger internal audience without having some comparison to see if that personalization effort has really made an impact. And then sometimes there's outliers in your data that can be interesting and you want to dive in deeper, but they might not really carry the weight of a larger subset of data that would be more useful to crafting those personas. And then also sometimes when you're presenting the data, you're trying to make the case to management or other people about what you should be doing. And sometimes there can be an information overload factor here. So thinking about a storytelling approach and what you're really trying to tell with the data itself can really help you get better buy-in internally to execute. And then lastly, just assumptions in general. I think it's really important to be always thinking about how can you check your assumptions at the door. A good example of how this can happen sometimes is with navigation, and that's what this image is here. So sometimes you craft a path that you want to guide people down to get to a certain goal, but it's easy to forget that sometimes there's other ways to find that information or that product or that report, whether it's from search or from Googling outside. So just being aware of all the possibilities for someone to go down a journey is really important. That can really steer you clear of certain obstacles when it comes to a successful endeavor. Next, we're going to talk about segmenting your users based on data. So it's really important, we find, that you take a crawl, walk, run approach to this. And from our perspective, the crawl is really around the listening piece. You want to make sure you're pulling everything in and understanding what makes the personas that you want to prioritize, understanding what their behavior is like, looking at potential members, existing members, early stage, late stage in career. There's a lot of choices, but it really is good to target a couple to start with and not try to do everything at once. I think people who might have gone through this similar process with social media will find that if you're trying to do 6 social media accounts on 6 different platforms versus maybe 1 or 2, it's harder to kind of boil the ocean, if you will. So thinking in terms of which are your priorities and really working to not just understand how to target to them, but really getting your own internal organization familiar and comfortable with growing this out is really important. Next, we're going to talk about creating content. So we want to make sure that you're thinking about content that does align with the personas. And so from this perspective, you want to think both broadly as well as narrowly. So, and then also understanding, as I said, there's an exponentially greater amount of content in general that needs to be accounted for to really make sure that the experience is customized and intuitive and providing value to your users. So the content can be everything from your website to your mobile. And I did separate those on purpose because the mobile experience often can and should be different based on where people are, what they're trying to accomplish, and what you're able to provide. Thinking in terms of social media, what content goes there that can be both fed into your site and shared outwardly, and understanding how perhaps links in your social media might have the right tracking. Or sending people to the right targeted page. So if you're using certain hashtags in your social media that might align with some of the attributes of that targeted persona, and then you're driving them to a targeted landing page. These are all pieces to keep in mind. Obviously, your emails, thinking about how targeted you can or should be within that space. Maybe sometimes you're going to do some A/B testing around a couple different topics, or you're going to segment your email by your persona so that you might drive people to generally the same place, but you might have different parts that would resonate better with a younger member versus an older member. So you want to make sure that you're thoughtful and not just driving people to a front door where they are then having to figure out what is actually the most relevant for them or what they need to do next. And thinking about interactive tools as well, especially with associations and looking to be that resource and that support over many years. Looking at things that could help advance people in their career, whether they're starting out or maybe they're trying to retool and reinvent themselves as digital has really taken front and center stage with what people are trying to do. There's a lot of opportunity there to have people be engaged and really draw out a lot of information from who they are, which could help you better craft the user experience elsewhere outside of that tool. And then obviously thinking about other devices, thinking about even like an Apple Watch or tablets or just a lot of different places where the information could flow. Thinking about how you're describing your content is really important. I think every time you have anything over, say, 5 pages, there's a real opportunity there to think about how you might want to characterize this in different ways based on your personas. You could also even take a page out of things like newspapers, where maybe they will often advertise or tweet multiple times in a day on the same article where they're giving different pieces of that picture. Looking at things like product summaries, if you have those, or your blog posts, these are also very important. And obviously caffeine is a real good investment around this time because there's a lot to do, and I don't think you can ever go too deep if you really are on track with the stats and with the segmentation. But it is something that you want to be thoughtful on. You want to make sure that you're not rushing it, that you're thinking about all the pieces, including the metadata that sometimes gets lost in the shuffle. And you also want to think, in addition to the broad perspective, you want to think about narrow, subtle pieces. And I'm thinking around things like calls to actions or buttons. If you're personalizing a call to action, you might just tweak the language that calls people to click, depending on if they're already a member or if they're a potential member or where they are in their career. You don't have to do big sweeping content all the time. There are a lot of subtle opportunities within calls to action. And then, as I mentioned earlier, pre-populating forms can be a really great experience, because this is a good example of something that gets back to that experience being more important than the brand, where if you're just being intuitive with the technology you're using and you're helping your user efficiently get through without having to be redundant and sort of getting away from the sort of DMV approach to having to fill out multiple forms over and over again, that can be a real win within an organization. And sometimes it's something that's overlooked because we're more focused on a homepage or a campaign, but when you're really at that point where people are actually engaging with you, I think especially in a personalization exercise, it's even more important. And it's also just important to think about how many touch points you have with those user journeys and where you could customize content. And maybe you don't do it all at once, but you start to look at where you could over time and then develop that sort of prioritization. And then you can also develop an editorial calendar that is defined. Each calendar is sort of defined for the persona. And this is a really good opportunity to sort of have a rubber meets the road situation where you can stress test the content by visualizing it from a calendar perspective to see what is going to be shown, but it doesn't have to be completely done at this point. It helps you align your efforts around different activities. And so again, similar to social media, sometimes working around a reel or a contrived event can be really great around an announcement, an event you're hosting, promotions, the release date of a report. These are wonderful times to really focus a persona-based editorial approach. And as you're doing that, it's really important to think about a couple key questions, like who is this content really serving? And if you can't answer that, you probably need to get some more data and some more research undertaken. If you don't understand what problems this might be addressing or how this can benefit the user, this can kind of go back to that sort of brand awareness and feeling of that you're looking out for them. And then just what added value does this content give to that specific persona? Sometimes it's just a matter of a subtle change to a blurb or a headline that can really make a difference. And you just want to put those pieces together early. And then that's another area where doing a couple personas to start can really give you a muscle memory to then execute on a similar approach with future personas. And then you also want to very much check for context and tone. You want to understand what does this look like in context of everything else on a page or potentially in a social media account. You want to understand how different segments may process or react to content differently. And depending on what your demographics are, there might be people that are at different learning levels or fluency levels within the language you're showing, but might have a real need for your association to support them. So making sure that you're using good plain language guidelines can be really important, that it doesn't require too much thought to actually process what is being shared. I tend to go on a rule of thumb that people don't really spend more than 30% of their attention on any one thing at any given time. And so you kind of want to look at the content and make sure it still resonates, even if you're not really, really looking at it closely. And that it's intuitive, that you don't have too many calls to action on a page, that the colors look right, that they're not being built in a silo. You want to understand what the the perception of the value is. You also want to understand, are there conflicts that could really cause bad confusion where you're being told one thing in the personalized space and you're reading it in context of something that is guiding you in potentially a different direction, that could be really detrimental. And then instead of the goal of simplifying people's lives digitally with personalization, you've effectively done the opposite. Thinking about younger members, I mentioned younger members a lot because a lot of the work done with associations has really been focused on understanding how to get them interested in the services you provide. And sometimes there's a lot of opportunity to provide that content and that context with a better understanding of what they're searching for, both within Google search as well as your own website. And then thinking about where people are located. What information do you have about where they physically are? What time of year is it? Sometimes people repurpose content and there might be a legacy reference to a season. These are things that easily slip through the cracks. And so you just want to make sure that it looks like you're really paying that close attention, because this really is an initial introduction sometimes to having a deeper conversation, with your audiences.
Have you ever had a client that typically don't do KPIs, and a lot of people aren't really up with KPIs? Do you guys kind of help them create and or develop their own KPIs?
Yeah, that's actually one of the first things we do, because sometimes, we'll even see a KPI as get the website launched, which I understand the motivation, but that's not necessarily a great, benchmark to work from. And so we tend to segment them a bit so that we're understanding what's deeply measurable and what's more of a kind of speaking to management type of level. But I think it's critically important for people to have that conversation, because you'll probably find that there'll be different perspectives on that, and that getting that discussed early on in the process is really important. And I kind of liken it to when people review a wireframe on a redesign. I always tell people that the truth will come out eventually through the project. But everybody is not afraid to ask what they think might be a stupid question. I'm 90% sure that someone else has already thought of it, and they're also scared to ask it. So applying this logic, because if you make that realization late and then you still have to go back and change things, you've effectively slowed down the process, made it more costly. And so it's really important to have that open dialogue. And especially when you're talking with people from, wearing these different hats, as I mentioned, I think it's really important.
Yeah, especially when you have companies that have smaller IT departments and, everybody has input everywhere and everybody has their own technology hat. So, yeah. Have you come across any clients with just wrecked websites and you were like, what did they do?
I love those. I joke internally that the bar is low, right? Your before and after shots are going to be wonderful. And, but I think that it also reflects sometimes different needs and different points in time. Some of this technology wasn't as advanced as it is now. And so people don't tend to redesign all the time. We do recommend kind of an iterative approach to improvement, but that isn't always the case, obviously. So you have everything from mergers to changes in leadership, changes in technology platforms. We work with open source technology partly because it is so prevalent. So it's something that people can kind of keep working with, and it makes integrations with a lot of platforms work better. And, sometimes over the years, people have started with a one size fits all digital platform that they're told also works as a content management system, but they find it doesn't really meet their needs. And so you sort of see this ebb and flow between these different preferences around different technologies and different content needs. So yeah, I think it's something is always messed up somewhere because of just the nature of how you need to, keep progressing. And there's always room for improvement. I used to work in the newspaper industry, and there was a famous sports writer named Shirley Povich who would say, the story's never been written that couldn't be written better. And I think that's a really good way to think about everything. I also had an editor who once said, I never thought it was possible each paragraph worse than the one before. I'm just glad he wasn't talking about my story, but I feel like those are good bookends in the same kind of premise.
So you have some real good content feedback to help out with people as well.
I've been working as a web producer off and on for about 25 years. And so most of my perspective tends to be for advocating for the web producer, mostly because I find that if they're not in a situation between the general understanding and the tools of how to do their job effectively, there can be a kind of a fatigue and a resentment. And so that really manifests itself, especially towards the end of that content editorial process, where they'll get it up and then they don't necessarily have the energy or the focus to put all the metadata in that really can support a lot of general best web best practices. And so that's just generally without a personalized site. So then when you're talking about the exponential nature of possibly 4 or 5 times that amount of content within certain sections, it can really take a toll.
Okay. And also for those who are not technologically inclined to understand, what is metadata?
So metadata is, you can think about it as the content that is in your website, but not on your website. So if you're searching Google and you see a description, that content is it's scraped from in your website in the kind of code, but it isn't always published on your pages. And so when you're thinking about what descriptions you're putting into certain fields in your content management system, you want to think about it as almost selling your content, because people have choices to make. And so you want to make sure that you're giving the best articulate, concise summary of that content. And that appears in places like the description, the title tags, a lot of those pieces. And I put my information in the chat. Feel free to email me directly. I think this is a wonderful opportunity. As that 60% slide, I really feel like tells a large story, and we have the experience and the partnerships and the general curiosity that is required to really make these projects work well. So appreciate everyone's time. Thank you very much.
No, thank you so much, Chad. I think you kind of woke some folks up.
And I did want to make the point that simple is not easy, but it doesn't mean it's impossible. So
right.
Love to, even if people just want to vent, I'm happy to talk. Thank you.
Oh, that's cool. And guys, if you want to continue the discussion with Chad or members of Unleash Technology, don't forget to go down to the function area and hit drop and business card, or request a meeting in the booth tile for Unleash Technologies. Okay.
And I'll also be there Monday in person at the 8:30 to 1 o'clock event. So if people want to meet up then, I'm happy to chat there too.
Cool. Thank you so much, Chad.
Thank you.